Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of military leaders, all to distill from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional lives. So today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite books about World War II. It's an absolute classic of the war, and that is With the Old Breed by E.B. Sledge. So it has a longer title. Where's the With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa. E.B. Sledge was a young Marine who fought in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And the book, The Old Breed, was written quite some time later. I want to say in the 80s even? Yeah, 1981. So the book was written 36 years after World War II ended. And it's the reflections of a man who at that point was variously in his late 50s, early 60s, on the experience he had as a much younger man in what was truly the most horrible war of all time. But in the light of a more contemporary, with some distance to it, I think is the best way to put it. Right? He wasn't. There were quite a number of books written in the late 40s and 50s. Many of the key leaders of World War II wrote memoirs and even into the 1970s. But already into the 1980s, there had been some distance, and so With the Old Breed has that advantage, if you will, as it examines what happened to the author during that time period. So I'm going to give you just kind of a brief summary of the book. How the various events ended up are, I'm not giving away any secrets. E.B. Sledge, by the way, his name is Eugene B. Sledge. We make fun of that name Eugene these days, I think, unfortunately, but it was a very popular name in the 1930s and 1940s and even into the 50s. So Sledge enlists, the book starts out with his background and training. Sledge enlists in the Marine Corps. He goes to Marine Corps boot camp, which was, as it is today, recognized as the most rigorous boot camp. And then he goes on to mortarman training. A mortar is a type of, it's kind of a tube that shoots a shell. So it's a small arm. It's like miniature artillery almost. And then he's assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. So 5th Marine Regiment. In World War II, the Marine Corps was still organized into battalions and regiments. Nowadays, the regimental level doesn't really exist. And he was part of the 1st Marine Division, which he calls the Old Breed. They were a band of hardened, experienced Marines. And after training, the unit stages on Pavuvu Island in the South Pacific. So the first battle in which Sledge fights is the Battle of Peleliu, which happened on September 14th, 1944. So the war has already been going on in the Pacific for 2 years, basically, or almost 2 years. And Sledge and his company, they land on Peleliu expecting a short fight. And in the event, it turns out to be a very long brutal campaign. So the Japanese resistance was fierce, well organized. They used hidden defensive positions rather than the sort of infamous banzai charges. Um, and Sledge describes in pretty graphic detail the physical and psychological toll of combat, um, done with close range shelling, the constant fear, the filth, and just the really dehumanizing effects of the war. So he recounts um, just instances of really gruesome behavior of soldiers, taking souvenirs from Japanese corpses, including gold teeth. Um, and then he also talks about how Company K suffered very heavy losses, including um, uh, Captain Andrew, known as Akak Haldane, who was killed. And this is a leader that Sledge deeply respects, and so it has a pretty profound impact on him. And then after weeks of vicious fighting, the for however difficult the combat was in Europe, the combat in the South Pacific was much more brutal. And so after several weeks of vicious combat, the island is secured. And so Peleliu's company is redeployed back to Pavuvu for rest and reorganization. And during this period of this part of the book, I should say, Sedge reflects on how he thinks historians will later judge the battle. Was it strategically necessary to take Peleliu, given the high costs and the very limited gains? This is a discussion that goes on today. And I will say, to digress for just a minute, I think that it's much easier to be a Monday morning quarterback in these situations than it is to know, what should have been done at the time. So, it's all good and well for us to conclude that perhaps, Peleliu should not have been taken, but of course, at the time, the anticipation was it was going to be a pretty easy fight, number one, and number two, it seemed like a logical step in the island hopping strategy that both senior commanders in the Pacific Theater of Operations were employing. So after his company's period resting and reorganizing, getting replacements and such at Pavuvu, Sledge and his company are sent to Okinawa, which was the site of one of the largest and one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific Theater. Now, for those of you who watch the show regularly, you know that my first duty station in the Navy, I was my family and I were sent to Okinawa. I got to tour some of the tunnels that the Japanese had built there during World War II, and I looked at some of the areas where American or Allied troops had landed. So I got a little bit of a feel. And I will say that when I was there, which I arrived in Okinawa around this time, a few weeks later, into December of 2006, and was there until early 2010. The impact of World War II is still felt on and by the Okinawans to this day. I will. One of the things that I found most interesting, I think, is the best way to put it. So many Okinawan babies were killed during World War II. Okinawan women especially have a deep, deep love for children. and a deep, I think, longing in a way for all of these children who were killed or murdered. And I remember still, I'll never forget this, being in the exchange, what's known as the NEX, the Navy Exchange. It's like a department store on a military base, with my then wife, who was very pregnant with our daughter Madeline. And an Okinawan woman approached us, and she said, "Oh, are you having a baby?" And my daughter's mother said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, oh, so lovely." And she started basically um, sort of rubbing my daughter's mother's stomach, which was, she was obviously pregnant. And later found out that this was a very, a not uncommon phenomenon, because it's kind of an outgrowth of World War II. So that something has carried on for so many decades. At that point, we're talking 40 years, I'm sorry, 60 years later. It's still impacting people who probably weren't born at that time. I don't think this woman was 60 years old. My recollection is she may be in her 50s, although maybe she was in her 60s. Maybe she was just a very young child during World War II. That she has this need, really, to somehow connect to the birth of children and to children in general. It speaks to just how brutal, how bloody, really beyond, I think, our comprehension to understand. So aside from the brutality of the battle, there was frequent rain. I can attest to that. It rained a lot while I was stationed on Okinawa. Deep mud, decomposing bodies, and just overwhelming physical and mental exhaustion. I was not used to a tropical climate when I got there. I found the heat and the humidity, especially in the beginning, very taxing. It was I'm not a person who likes to exercise inside in a gym in general. I think of exercise as something you do outside, but there were times when just walking around outside for 20 minutes seemed to be exhausting, because it was not uncommon to have temperatures in the 90s and humidity in the 90 plus percentile range. So it just, physically exhausting. And then and that leads to that alone can lead to a kind of mental exhaustion, let alone all of the horrors of combat and just the situation. So the American forces landed on Okinawa. The Japanese put up extremely fierce resistance. They would even infiltrate American positions at night, killing Marines and soldiers, if they could. There was relentless shelling, and that increased the stress and terror of being on Okinawa as well. So Sledge witnessed fellow Marines breaking down under what at the time was called combat fatigue, what today we would call post-traumatic stress, or even post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And he basically makes a personal pledge to maintain his sanity, which it appears he did. Leadership the quality of leadership in his unit is mixed. Some of the officers are compassionate and competent. Others are cruel, incompetent, clearly not up to speed in terms of what is necessary for the fight in which they're engaged. Eventually, of course, the Allies do secure Okinawa. And nearly concurrently with that, in the sort of broader war context, Germany surrenders. Okinawa was the last step before what otherwise would have been an invasion of the Japanese home islands. And of course, that was subsequently rendered unnecessary after the dropping of atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That led to the Japanese surrender and the end of World War II. So after Okinawa, Sledge serves in China during a time during the occupation, and then eventually he is sent back to the United States, where he has to grapple with reintegration into civilian life and mourning the loss of his comrades. There seems to be, I think, a somewhat wide misperception that World War II veterans quickly and effectively reintegrated back into American society. That was not the case for a large number of veterans. I refer you to a movie, an absolutely wonderful movie. It's fictional, but it rings very, very true. It's called The Best Years of Our Lives. It's about three World War II veterans who returned home. One was a prominent banker who had become a sergeant in the Army, I believe it is. One was, he was kind of just a get along to go along guy who ended up being an officer. And the third is a young private who lost both of his arms, and they were replaced by sort of metal hands. I mean, they're hooks is typically, and he returns home. He had been engaged to his girl before he left, and sort of the trauma of feeling useless, and how could she love him, and that sort of thing. And these three characters are emblematic of how difficult, of the types of difficulties that World War II veterans had. Jack Kerouac, who's part of the Beat Generation, who wrote the wonderful book On the Road, and this was another manifestation of the struggles that young men in particular had returning home after World War II. They were so young, and in many cases so naive and idealistic, and then to experience the horrors of World War II and to come back and to see what seemed to them in many cases the frivolity of civilian life and the luxury in which their fellow Americans had lived, because the war economy paid people so well after an extensive period of time known as the Great Depression. So all of these made reintegration into civilian society difficult for a large number of military personnel returning home. And in the end of the book, he reflects on the meaning of war, its waste, its brutality, but also the strength and loyalty that he found in his fellow Marines. So the book, I think it rings to me very authentic. Again, a man who's reflecting back on a time in his life that just like no other, really. And I don't think any of it. I was in the military, as I mentioned, a little while ago. I can't even imagine what E.B. Sledge and his comrades went through in World War II. I visited Guam while I was in the Navy, not when I was with the Marine Corps, but subsequently my next duty station when I was with a carrier air wing, and we made a port call in Guam, and I drove around and looked at some of the sort of memorials and museums there, looked at one of the invasion beaches. Having been a student of World War II for a long time, I took advantage of those situations where I could see firsthand. But even with those experiences, they're just the merest of echoes compared to what the men and women experienced who fought World War II. And in many cases, the fictional movies, I think, give a much better feel for what went on than some of the nonfiction books I've read. So movies like In Harm's Way, for example, and I mentioned The Best Years of Our Lives, the post World War II, set in post World War II. These movies I think are very worth watching if you really want to understand how people felt, because as fictional movies, they were trying to engage one's emotions. So the themes of the book are many. The brutality and horror of war. Sledge does not romanticize combat. Okay, so he vividly describes the physical, the filth, the fear, the moral degradation that the war induces. So this is where I think fictional movies and reality part company, in the sense a lot of especially early movies. The Fighting Seabees comes to mind. It's a great John Wayne movie. It's a lot of fun to watch, but it almost romanticizes combat. John Wayne's movies often did, and it was by design. The War Department would not allow. The War Department would not. John Wayne wanted to enlist in the military when World War II broke out, and they would not accept his enlistment. They told him, "You're better off staying on the home front and making movies to buoy civilian morale." And they wanted him making movies like, The Fighting Seabees and such. So the way combat is depicted in movies oftentimes that's not realistic, whereas E.B. Sledge's writing about it definitely is. He talks about another theme is the psychological trauma. So in World War I, there were, they called it shell shock. In World War II, combat fatigue, and more recently we call it PTSD. These were all ways of describing the mental and emotional, psychological injuries that especially men in combat, to which men in combat fell prey, and they're real. They're real. I won't get into discussions of George Patton and all that kind of stuff, but there is psychological trauma is a fact of war. He talks, another theme is comradeship and brotherhood. So despite the horror, or maybe indeed kind of because of the horror, this sort of band of brothers idea is developed. And that's what helps Sledge survive his bond with his fellow Marines, the loyalty, the courage, the shared suffering, okay, that gets them through. He also, another theme is the loss of innocence. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, many of the young men who enlisted in the military especially after Pearl Harbor, they were right off the farm. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They had lived their whole lives in rural America. They had never really been away from home. They want to fight for their country. They want to fight for freedom and democracy. All of these ideas that were being talked about at that time. And then they were confronted with the reality of a modern day war. And it was just a very deep loss of innocence on the part of these young men. And it really just, it was stripped away from them, almost like they were peeled like bananas. And and it really forced Sledge himself, as was the case with many young service members, were really forced to confront humanity's very darkest sides, and quite disturbing. Another theme was the moral cost of war. So while Sledge is critical of enemy violence and how they desecrated, the bodies of Americans, he also is critical of how the war virtually forced his fellow servicemen to dehumanize other people, including desecrating Japanese bodies for souvenirs. So, again, I think I know the perception of World War II when I was growing up as a boy was Americans behaved absolutely scrupulously, righteously, and the Japanese, were essentially evil, and that's not historical. War brutalized a lot of Americans in a way that they came to do at times some horrific things. And then finally, the final theme that I want to mention is the sense of duty versus waste. So while Sledge respects the valor and commitment of his comrades, he laments the terrible waste of human life and the senselessness of the violence. And that's not to say that he's anti-war. I think he's pragmatic enough to understand that World War II had to be fought. But I think most people don't believe me when I say this, but I think the most anti-war people I've ever met are people in the military, because we see firsthand the impact that war has on people, on our comrades, on ourselves, on the enemy. And it's just not a pretty thing to see. And if there were another way, then I think most American service members would choose that way. Unfortunately, war has been around as long as human beings have been around, and it seems that at times war is inevitable. There is no other way sometimes, and so it is something that has to be faced and dealt with. So just a couple of other thoughts. There's a great deal of authenticity to the book, as I mentioned before. There's great historical value to it. You really get a ground level view of two brutal Pacific Theater battles. Unlike a lot of the books written about World War II, where you're really seeing at the strategic level, Sledge's book is really there. What Professor Robert Garland, whose course on everyday life and ancient history, calls the other side of history, right? The unknown people. It gives us that view. It's very well written. It has a great deal of literary merit, and it's also very, very impactful. So if you're only going to buy one World War II book for the holidays that you haven't read yet, and you haven't read With the Old Breed, I highly recommend it. I will put a link to buy the book on Amazon. Full disclosure, it's an affiliate link. If you click on the link and buy something, I think I get 3 cents or something like that. But it's very, very worthwhile. So let's take a break, and then let's look at some of the business lessons that we can learn from Sledge's fantastic book.
America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States, Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org.
So this is Business Lessons from the Military, and I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. I've just got done talking about the book With the Old Breed by Eugene B. Sledge. It's about his experience as a combat Marine during World War II in the Pacific Theater of Operations. So I have several business lessons, I think, that we can learn from Sledge's book. And the first one is that strong leadership saves organizations and weak leadership destroys them. So Sledge shows repeatedly throughout the book how good leaders, like Captain Andrew Akak Haldane, who was killed on Peleliu, protected their Marines, prepared them thoroughly, and communicated clearly, while poor leaders, such as some of the ones he noted on Okinawa, endangered their men through ego, incompetence, just sheer cussedness. And I had at a staff meeting for a company that I administrate for an estate. I had a conversation last week, and there's two women who work for this company, and we've been working together now for almost 2 years, a little bit less than that, a year and 9 months, I guess. And they've been surprised that I don't yell at them. And that's the best way I can put it. They're just surprised that I don't, and they keep waiting for that shoe to drop. And we've had conversations about what I think is appropriate behavior in a professional setting, and yelling and screaming is not included in that appropriate behavior. And yet, they keep, I think, they've been so used to that as a mode of communication that they haven't, even after almost 2 years, adjusted to not getting screamed at, basically, when something goes wrong. And it's hard. Now, this kind of inappropriate professional behavior, it pushes good people away. I think more so today than ever. Young people, they don't want to be screamed at. I don't know. Can you blame them? I certainly don't. I never liked being yelled at, ever. I didn't like my parents yelling at me when I was a kid. I didn't like being yelled at in a business or professional setting. And so I use that as just one teeny example of good versus bad leadership. Now, there are certainly times when a leader may get annoyed or angry, and letting other people see that the leader is annoyed or angry may be appropriate. But yelling at people, browbeating them, putting them down, that's never appropriate. It's completely counterproductive. And so strong leadership, I would argue, is self-controlled leadership. It's leadership that keeps its eye on the mission and works to keep the team, the force, whatever you want to call it, focused on achieving the mission. Okay. Whereas weak leadership is very tied up in self-promotion, in how the leader looks, maybe to people who are senior to the leader or to the board of directors, maybe to the public, and will even borderline or actually abuse other people in the organization in order to try and create what the leader thinks is the image that he wants to maintain elsewhere. So I think leaders who in business who combine competence, humility, moral courage, these are strong leaders, right? It is not a sign of leadership strength to suggest that the leader is never wrong. Okay. First of all, it encourages people to hide their mistakes, right? Because if the leader hides his, evidently that's what the leader wants. Uh, so humility, I think, is an important part of strong and good leadership, and we need to exercise that as we do moral courage. Okay. So uh, when the inevitable crunch comes, and it does with every business, every professional practice, okay, how the leader responds under pressure, that's the true test of leadership. It's very easy to lead when things are going well, when the company's making a lot of money, but how does a leader behave when he's under stress? Okay, that's number one. Number two, and this relates directly to what I was saying just a moment ago. Culture determines performance under stress. So the old breed, the first division United States Marine Corps, they held themselves to a high standard of discipline, professionalism, mutual respect, even amid the horror of war. And well, that's not to say that every Marine in the first division uh, achieved that standard. The culture that this was the standard in the Marine Corps, and frankly, not just with the first division. With I think there were 5 or 7 divisions of the Marine Corps by the end of World War II. So the culture of the Marine Corps itself functioned to keep Marines focused, physically and mentally fit, okay, when the conditions of combat should otherwise have broken them down, okay? And so it was the intensive training, it was the care that the officers showed their men, and in fact that officers, well, good officers shared hardships with their men. That's part of the culture of the Marine Corps, and it's something that lasts to this day. I saw it when I was stationed in Okinawa. There were good officers and there were bad officers, and the good officers lived by the ethos: I don't eat until my men have eaten, I don't rest until my men are bedded down. That was their ethos. Okay. And by the way, I knew some horrible, absolutely horrible officers while I was stationed in Okinawa. I won't go into what they did. I've talked about it in other shows. But the number of horrible officers was actually quite small compared to the total number of officers with whom I dealt when I was in Okinawa, or even especially with whom I met. And that's important. And the culture of the Marine Corps reinforces that. So we have to create the same kind of culture in our businesses, in the company, in the excuse me, in the company, in our companies, the companies we started, or even in the company of which we're a part. Okay, so a culture that reinforces accountability, teamwork, resilience, appropriate conduct. Okay, all of these are important, and they make inappropriate behavior the outlier. They don't prevent it. There are always going to be some people who are not going to do the right thing. It's the nature of any human endeavor. What we have to do is create a culture that envelops our people so it's harder for them to do the wrong thing. Okay. And this is especially true when crisis hits. So when crisis hits and people are having to to be more reactive. They maybe can't take quite as much time to respond to something as they might were it not a crisis. The culture should take hold. It should keep the organization moving toward resolving the crisis and continuing on to its goals. Excuse me. And that's how you'll know if indeed the culture really has become dominant in your business. Okay. So it's at those most difficult times. And that's this is the same thing in combat, right? You could see the culture of the Marine Corps best during these horrible times of combat. Okay, so we want to build the same kind of, again, accountability, teamwork, resilience, appropriate behavior into our organizations. We want to make it part of what they are, not just how we behave, but it's fundamental to what we are. That's what culture is. It has to be a part of, not something laid on top of our companies, our businesses, our organizations. Okay. Number 3, prepare for the reality, not the plan. So Peleliu was supposed to be a short operation. It wasn't. And the Marines who adapted to these unexpected conditions, they were the ones who survived. And those who clung to the assumption that this is going to be a short battle, it's going to be just kind of one and done kind of thing, they did not. Okay. So the ability to adjust one's mindset to actual conditions and not be held back by what one thinks the conditions ought to be or was told they would be. Okay, that is going to be the biggest determinator of success than any single thing. Okay, so and I've talked about this in other contexts, so I'm not going to on other shows. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with this, but every business has to make plans, okay, so that it has a sense of how to get to its objectives, how to get to its goals. Having said that, most plans. This is a play on von Moltke's old saying. Most plans fail on first contact with reality. Okay, so planning is essential. The plan, in most cases, is going to get thrown out the door once it's implemented. Okay, because the ability to adjust to the reality of the situation is what's going to get to the objective. Okay, so we need to encourage adaptability. We need to encourage planning that deals with multiple scenarios, so that within the plan is the assumption that things are not going to go in a linear fashion. All of this needs to be dealt with as part of the planning, so that in the event that reality does not allow the plan to be fulfilled as is, people can pivot, they can make changes, they can adapt. Okay, and they can adapt even to scenarios that weren't part of the original plan. Okay, and teams need to be rewarded for updating tactics and based on changing conditions. Okay, so if a product is launched and the original launch plan quickly turns out to not be practical, and the team makes a pivot that to an idea that may lead is more likely to lead to success. So that team should be rewarded for taking the initiative to make that pivot. Okay, even if they're not particularly successful, that they attempted to adapt to reality is the key idea, the key behavior that we want to encourage. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4, small acts of humanity matter in hard times. So I'm reminded of this commercial I see quite frequently when I'm watching my favorite show, Hogan's Heroes, on Pluto, and it's for Diet Coke. So my trainer, I think, would be mad if he heard me talking about a Diet Coke commercial. But there's a young woman. She's working on, I don't know, some kind of presentation, it looks like, and she has her hair in a ponytail. And the voiceover is saying, you know, your hair is in a ponytail. That's a sure sign that you woke up late and had to rush to get to work. And you know, so in other words, she's having a tough day, right? And a young man walks up carrying 2 Diet Cokes, and he asks her if she wants one, right? And she takes the Diet Coke, and the voiceover says, yeah, go ahead, take it. Let your hair down. She takes out her ponytail and just lets her hair. It's very cute commercial. I give Coca-Cola all the credit in the world for it. But it's just a little thing, right? And I don't, you know, presumably he's romantically interested in her. She's a, you know, attractive young woman. But I think, you know, it could also be that he sees his colleague is having a tough day, and he's like, hey, you know, it looks like you're having a tough day. Here, have something to drink. You want to just talk about it a little bit, kind of get it off your chest. And these are the kinds of things that we want, of which we want to be conscious, right? Because just some small thing like that can really turn the tide, right? So in Sledge's book, he talks about like sharing water, especially at times when getting fresh water was not easy, checking on a wounded buddy, you know, offering just a moment of kindness. It's sort of what kept, you know, the Marines, you know, sane amid all of the chaos of combat, right? And so, you know, like this man in the Diet Coke commercial, in the business environment, we want to do that as well. So, you know, sometimes just noticing that one of our people may be, you know, kind of off his or her game, and just going and saying, hey, how you doing? What's going on? You know, as a leader or just as a coworker, and just, you know, acknowledging that, you know, the person is there, that they may be having a struggle or whatever. You know, just a little thing like that can make all the difference to somebody's day, and therefore, you know, could really just, you know, kind of turn the tide for that person. Maybe they were feeling, you know, particularly overlooked or something, like nobody really cares. I dragged myself to work. I don't feel particularly well, and I'm just doing my work. Nobody cares. And, you know, and somebody comes up and says, hey, how you doing? Good to see you, you know, kind of thing. It's like, oh, someone does care that I'm here, and, you know, took the time to acknowledge. Little things like that, they can make a tremendous difference. And so as a Boy Scout, right? The Boy Scout motto is, well, the slogan, sorry, the Boy Scout motto is be prepared. The Boy Scout slogan is do a good turn daily, right? Now, as an Eagle Scout, this is going back a number of years ago now, I realized I should be living that slogan. And so I, you know, sort of built into just my daily activities, keeping on the lookout for an opportunity to do a good turn. Sometimes it's something as seemingly innocuous as I'm out walking and I see someone with his dog or her dog, and the dog is cute, and I say, "Oh, what a cute dog!" Dog owners love that, right? Other times, I remember. I was over in Beverly Hills by the corner of Beverly Drive in Charlieville, and a very nice, smartly dressed woman dropped her keys and they rolled under her car. And I'm just in my walking, and I can see she's going to kneel down, and I you know, kind of ran up and I said, "Ma'am, if you would permit me, may I get your keys for you? Because I wouldn't want you to get your clothes dirty." And she was like, "Oh, thank you. That would be so nice," right? And I had to crawl into the car a little bit to get the keys, but what did it matter? I was in, you know, exercise clothes. Who cares, right? And saved her the trouble, the hassle, right? So these little small acts really make a difference, and we should just have it kind of mostly in awareness to do as many of these as we can do during the day. Okay, next. Psychological safety is non-negotiable. So the Marines who couldn't decompress or talk openly about what they were experiencing, they were much more likely to break down mentally. That's what Sledge learned from the result of his combat experience. And the same is true in civilian life. Now, we tend to think of, because the antecedents to PTS, post-traumatic stress, are terms like battle fatigue and shell shock. We tend to think of it as only being something that's an outgrowth of combat. That is not the case. There are many circumstances that can cause PTS and PTSD in civilian life. There could be some kind of casualty at work. Somebody gets hurt, or worse, God forbid, somebody gets killed. Okay, or a similar thing happens, but not at work, just sort of out in whatever. Being in an automobile accident, again, all these things, God forbid that they should happen to anyone. So these challenge us. They challenge our psychological wellness. Okay, even our mental stability at times, and we have to have a way to deal with them. Now, I know for myself, I exercise regularly. That's one of the ways I keep myself mentally fit, because exercise is such a good thing for mental fitness. But I also talk with my friends. Okay, and when something's going on, I share with them. They listen to me, and likewise, when stuff's going on with them, they call me and I listen to them. Just kind of get it off our chests. Okay. Now, there's a balance. We don't want to be, enmeshing ourselves in a continual complaining about any particular thing. But in general, talking about things and just sort of contextualizing them is a good thing. And when we can have very stressful times in the workplace, whether it's a new product launch, whether it's a big change in economic conditions that happen rather suddenly. These things can lead to a lot of workplace stress, and it has to be dealt with. Suppressing it, maybe there was a time when that was a reasonable strategy. Probably not these days. Right? We're not taught to suppress our emotions like previous generations were, and so we have to find mechanisms, processes that can be used by our team members, even in the workplace, to deal with keeping people psychologically well, okay, psychologically safe. And so, not sweeping these things under the rug will lead to stronger teams, greater success for our organizations. Okay. And then finally, and this, I think, is the hallmark of the United States Marine Corps, for which, if it's not obvious, I have a lot of respect as a Navy man myself, a lot of respect for the United States Marine Corps. Shared purpose creates extraordinary commitment. So the Marines on Peleliu and Okinawa, they endured seemingly unendurable hardship because they believed in their mission and they believed in each other. They overcame fatigue, fear, horrible conditions, soaking rain, knee-deep mud, shelling, vermin, disease. They overcame all of that and emerged victorious in World War II because they shared an extraordinary commitment. Okay, that's part of the Marine Corps ethos. It's going back full circle to this idea of culture. Okay, it's part of the Marine Corps culture that the commitment is a shared commitment. Okay, and every Marine is working with every other Marine to bring it about. And so we need to have a why, a mission to our business. What are we trying to do? Something that will inspire our people, inspire our teams in a meaningful, authentic way, not something that's just pastiche, that's sort of a coat of paint layered over the same old stuff. No, something that will truly inspire, that's achievable, that's meaningful to people. Okay. And then we need to build commitment for that mission. Okay. And then through the extraordinary commitment to that mission, it will be met. It might not be met as quickly as we'd hope, like on Peleliu, turned out not to be a short battle. But eventually victory was achieved. And that's what extraordinary commitment will give us in our organizations. We may have a goal that we want to reach in 6 months, and we're 110% committed to it, and yet it still takes us 18 months to get there. That's how life is sometimes. But how much longer would it have taken to get there if we didn't have extraordinary commitment? And in fact, would we ever have gotten there at all without extraordinary commitment? Those are the relevant questions. So those are the 6 lessons I think can be learned from reading, again, With the Old Breed by Eugene B. Sledge. Again, just a marvelous, marvelous book. Cannot recommend it highly enough. And I'd be interested if you've read the book and you were just interested in hearing my take on it. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about what I've said, the lessons that I mentioned, and you can post them in social media. All the links will be in the show notes. And again, would love to hear your thoughts. So tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Wednesday is a special edition of the Way to Wow shows for Thanksgiving, which is of course the next day, Thursday. So I hope you'll join me then. And then of course I'll be back next week for the regular slate of shows. So I thank you very much for joining me today, especially my live viewers. When I point up here, it's because I have a counter right there that says how many people are watching live. So thanks so much for joining me. Wishing you well. If you know someone you think might like the show or certainly would benefit from the show, please tell them about it. Maybe send them a link to one of the episodes. I'd love to have the opportunity and would deeply appreciate having the opportunity to win them as a viewer and maybe even a subscriber. So, a work colleague or someone else in business, that would be terrific. Thank you. I would thank you very much for that. So let's see. That just leads me to say again, thank you so much for watching. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.